Hello to all of you, and welcome to another episode of PTR Perspective. In this episode, we'll be discussing extensively on the topic of port electrification, focusing on shore power and its role in maritime industry decarbonization. Shore power, which is also termed as cold ironing, shore to ship technology, alternative maritime power, and onshore power supply, which enables the vessels to shut down their onboard diesel generators while berthing at docking points and providing electric power from the electrical grid. Shore power is aimed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, NOx reduction, noise pollution reduction, and vibration that is produced due to the onboard diesel generators of vessel. We have seen a lot of movement in the electrification of the road transport sector. In this episode, we'll be diving into the electrification of the maritime industry. Really would like to see that what is the focus of the industry overall when it comes to the reduction of carbon footprint. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce my two co-participants, Ralf Nielsen and Mustafa Mirza. Ralf is the sales manager for shore power at PowerCon, based in Denmark. He has over 7 years of experience in professional sales and business development and has proactively been involved in creating and maintaining a strong sales pipeline and stakeholder engagements. Prior to PowerCon, he has also worked as a senior commercial advisor at Trade Council of Denmark in North America, and he was based in the US. In addition to Ralf, I have today a colleague of mine, Mustafa Mirza, who is working as an analyst at Power Technology Research. Mustafa focuses on new energy topics related to port electrification, and he is supporting several key players in North America and Europe, particularly on the shore electrification technologies such as shore-to-ship power and vessel charging. Currently, he's looking at the topic of port electrification in the grand scheme of things and researching on ports as a potential future energy hubs. And lastly, I'm Saqib Saeed, Chief Research Officer at Power Technology Research. I've been active in the power sector for the last 10 years, and in my current role at PTR, I oversee the entire research processes involving power grid and new energy topics. All right, to kick off our discussion, gentlemen, I'd like to jump into our first theme of today, that is role of port electrification in maritime industry decarbonization, specifically focusing on shore power in pushing the clean energy space in maritime industry forward. Let me start with a very basic question. How do you think that port electrification, what kind of role is being played by port electrification in reducing the carbon footprint across the maritime industry? Ralf, would you like to comment on this first?
Yeah, sure. I can start out. I think port electrification plays and will play a huge role in the overall decarbonization of the maritime industry. I think just like you mentioned in your introduction, Saqib, that ports are hubs. It's the main sort of intersection of the industry, and I think that creates a lot of opportunity for electrification and for sustainability overall, I guess you can say. So I think without a doubt that port electrification will play a continuously big role in also bringing the industry together around this overall challenge of increasing sustainability across the industry, really. So I think there are many opportunities in ports specifically because of this. And I think you also specifically in ports see some very good scenarios, you can say, for applying good technologies and also technologies that are available today, and of course also moving forward will be a hub for developing the technologies of the future, so to speak. So I think, yeah, again, without a doubt, the ports will be a big player in this role.
And Rob, do you think that the amount of effort being put into the decarbonization of road transport sector, can we sort of make a comparison that the targets set in terms of the carbon footprint reduction on the road transport sector, are they sort of equivalent on the maritime industry side as well?
I think in general, you can see that the maritime sector has been overlooked, so to speak, a little bit compared to the road transport industry. But I definitely think that the maritime industry is catching up. It's getting a lot of attention. Also, now we start to see that at a political level as well. Also in regards to shore power specifically, where ministers are talking about it and getting commitment from other ministers around the world. So I think the maritime industry in general is definitely catching up. Of course, also with the industry itself, trying to push forward, trying to get some attention, so to speak. Also because I mean, it's no secret that sustainability is an investment. It's not cheap. So, of course, also to get the needed support from from local governments, from funding schemes, from whatever it might
Mhm.
take. I think again they're catching up, but I think there's we definitely still need to keep pushing for sure. Again, because if you ask me, I believe that there are greater potential in decarbonizing the maritime industry,
Mhm.
because if you, like you mentioned, try to compare to the road transport industry, there are not as many variables when you
Mm.
start comparing the industries in that sense. So the opportunity for decarbonizing the industry is, I believe, is much greater in the maritime and specifically the port industry. So I think there are definitely some good points that are coming up that are being presented, and that are definitely getting traction in the market, I think.
Great. Mustafa, what's your take on port electrification as kind of an engine to reduce the carbon footprint in the maritime industry?
Yeah, Saqib, I would like to agree to what Ralph has said and building upon his ideas and points. Generally, I always give this example of ports being very historical centers of economy, where we actually see that the great civilizations have actually spawned across and around the ports and bodies of water. So, of course, ports have been there since we started to live as a humanity, and they've always been. They've played a vital role in their respective national economies. But now, in the 21st century, and when we're talking about decarbonization, they're also becoming what we call, or what the industry is now calling as energy hubs. So port electrification is something of a complete value chain that actually aims to decarbonize all the activities which are being undertaken at ports. There are several new activities and several new technologies which are actually being integrated into the, you could say, the normal or the traditional activities which have always taken place on ports. So a very simple example would be, um, recently ports are becoming a site for the installation of offshore renewable sources
Mhm.
as well. So offshore wind farms are being installed on ports across the world. Offshore or onshore solar power is also being installed for to provide clean electricity to the
Mhm.
port activities. So this is just one example. If we look at the equipment which is being used on ports, for example, trucks, vans, forklifts,
Mhm.
cranes. We're seeing that ports are heavily investing in the electrification of these vehicles and these equipments as well. So we're seeing a demand for EV chargers on ports as well. And let me just take an example of Port of Oslo in Norway, which has actually devised a grand plan to decarbonize its shoreside activity as well
Mhm.
by electrifying the fleets, installing EV chargers, and you can see many more examples in the industry as well, which is coming up. Then, of course, we also see examples of ports becoming a storage site for alternative marine fuels as well. So, for
Mhm.
example, storage site for hydrogen, storage site for ammonia. So we're seeing these new fuels as well, which are being added into the mix of traditional fuels like oil and gas, LNG, LPG, etc.
Mhm.
So yeah, we're seeing a lot of new activity around ports and in ports as well. Finally, of course, when we talk about ports, there's always ships, right? Which is the vessel side or the shore side activity. So over there, we're actually seeing a boom in shore-to-ship power installations, especially across Europe. But we're also seeing a boom in the west coast of the North American region as well, in US and
Mhm.
Canada. where we're actually seeing lots of systems being installed for cruise vessels, for ferries, for different types of vessels, and of course, a new type of technology, or you could say a new generation of ships are being born, which you could call fully electric vessels or hybrid vessels, and for that we need vessel chargers as well. So yeah, it's a complete package, and like ports are looking to decarbonize both aspects of their activities, the shore side activity and the ship side activity as well.
Great point, Mustafa. So it's what I understand is it's the entire ecosystem which is being developed. It's not just one topic of port electrification, as you mentioned, renewable energy, ensuring that if anything is being charged, that it's using clean energy. So that's another example of the whole ecosystem being developed on the shore side. Great. Ralf, you mentioned that there is a huge opportunity when we compare the maritime industry and road transport sector. Let's look at the attention that the two are getting. We've seen a lot of movement when it comes to electrification of the road transport sector, and it's not only passenger vehicles. It has gone beyond passenger vehicles. You name it, electric buses, electric trucks, and it's now even penetrating the off highway vehicles as well. So you have agriculture, construction, so a lot of attention being put into these areas, right? So if you compare the attention, do you think that the two industries are at the same level, or you think more needs to be done on the maritime industry side?
Well, I think I'm a little bit biased in that sense. I definitely still, to my point earlier, I think the maritime industry in general is a little bit behind. I think definitely more could be done, and more is being done. As I mentioned, the market is picking up and picking up quickly. I mean, just for our niche market with shore power, I mean, we've been in it for over 5 years, and it's been booming tremendously. And I think that's a strong testimony to the industry in general. Seeing, of course, shore power, but also in general committing to decarbonization and to sustainability overall. I think a lot has happened also, especially for the cruise segment. If we focus on that, just with COVID having a break, so to speak, having a pause to really think about it, and having to come out of the gate, so to speak, with a new approach and then a more sustainable approach. I mean, we are of course talking to industry people as well who's been in for example, the cruise segment for 20, 30 years, and they're saying they have never seen anything like this. There's been a lot of talk about it, but now we've finally seen some action. So I think that's a strong testimony to the fact that the maritime industry is catching up to the road side of it, so to speak. But again, more needs to be done. More will be done. I'm sure of it. Just for the shore power, we're seeing a lot of support. Funding schemes being established. Again, the political side of it, the rules and framework, so to speak, around it is being, coming into place, so to speak. We're constantly seeing new developments and new improvements to the standard of the industry and how to implement this technology, which is, of course, a big task in itself, to say the least. So I do think that there's a lot of important work going on that needs to continue for sure, and we of course hope and believe that it will, in order for the maritime industry to catch up. So yeah.
So it's getting more traction, but more needs to be done. And I think if we compare the patterns of what was happening in terms of the electrification of the road transport sector, let's say 6 years ago, we can find similar patterns in the maritime industry as well, right? So we can expect a similar trajectory moving forward for this industry too. All right, great. Let me then move on to the next topic, and that is the incentives and what other driving factors are there for this market of shore power. From our team that actually works on the electrification of road transport sector, I've received a lot of insights from them that it is a very incentive-driven market. Actually, let me share a very interesting story. I was looking at the data that I received from one of my team members on German EV charger market, and then we were comparing the number of chargers which were installed in 2021, and then we were comparing it with number of EVs. And for some quarters, there were more chargers than EVs, and we were like, oh, there's something wrong with the data. what's going on, and we realized that there is an incentive going on in Germany that you can basically get the EV charger for free, right? So people were buying even though they didn't have an electric vehicle to drive, right? So it's a very incentive driven market. So huge opportunities, European Green Deal, bipartisan infrastructure plan in the US. These are some examples in terms of the incentives and the grants given to this industry. Mustafa, let's have you start on this topic. Do you think similar kind of investments and, let's say, grants and incentives are being pumped into the shore power industry as well? And where do you think the push is coming? And if not, where will it come from?
Right. So you mentioned the EU Green Deal and the bipartisan infrastructure plan. Yes, these plans actually cover maritime electrification or shore power as well. There are multiple mechanisms within these targets and plans to actually implement maritime decarbonization. Now, if you look at some markets, I like to categorize the shore power markets into three distinct regions. So first is Europe, which I call it the leading market. Then it's North America, which includes the US and Canada primarily, which I call as the emerging markets. If we take the state of California as a standalone state, then yes, it is quite a mature market. But generally speaking, the US and Canada are emerging markets. And the third, which I call a huge potential market, is the APAC region, the Asia Pacific region. So you have advanced economies like Japan and Korea. You have also emerging economies like India, Malaysia, and Indonesia, which has huge shipping potential, and they actually ship a lot. China, of course, is a huge market, and it already has a lot of shore power systems. Um, Although, of course, it's taken separately from the APAC region. Now, reverting back to the topic in hand, which is the incentives or the fundings which are available. Now, if we move back to Europe, we see Norway is the leading country in shore-to-ship power market in Europe as well. So, and where is the funding coming from? Mainly, it's coming from Innova, which is a state fund. The Norwegian government provides the funds. So, and Innova has actually, provided funding for over 100 shore power systems in Norway since 2016. Um, of course, when you have fundings for 100 projects, it actually makes you the leading market for shore power in Europe and in extension globally as well. Then if we move to other European countries, for example, with Spain, you have the OPS master plan in Spain, which is actually being the state-owned Spanish company, which is called Puertos del Estado, which is the which manages all the state-owned ports, is actually bringing all the stakeholders involved in the shore power industry, be it electricity utility companies, shipping companies, engineering companies, EPCs, OEMs. It's bringing everybody under one umbrella to actually make it easy for the propagation of technology of the shore power technology on its shores. We have all the state-owned ports in Spain which are involved in this program as well. If you look at, if you move across the Atlantic, we look at the U.S. market, specifically the Californian market. We see that the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, has its At Birth program, which is perhaps the most ambitious plan in North America for shore power systems. And they've been working since a couple of years now in installing shore power systems. And of course, this has enabled the formation of a string of shore power connections in the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, San Diego, San Francisco. They have a lot of systems down there, and to actually back that, CARB has actually granted around $24 million dollars worth of funding to just Port of Los Angeles. So we can see a lot of funding being pumped into. So when the funding is pumped, then we see a lot of systems being installed on the respective ports. Um, Under the car program, we have seen the Carl Moyer funding program as well, which provides funding for shore power systems. So yeah, uh, it is a funding driven market, you could say, an incentive driven market. The markets or the governments which are involved in providing funding directly to the ports, we're seeing a lot of systems being installed over there.
Right. So the message is that it is an incentive-driven market partially, as you've said, and the initial, let's say, inertia will be broken with the investment being pumped into this. We hope that it is not a kind of an artificial inertia, right? If it goes away, if the incentives or the funding, let's say, is taken away from this industry, as we saw in China, right? Back in 2020, 2021, the sales of EVs went down because certain incentives were taken out from the market. Um, Understood. This is one sort of piece of the puzzle, Ralph. If we then move to you, do you think what role can OEMs play when it comes to manufacturing the equipment, right? And in terms of the opportunity available for different manufacturers, do you think it's something that only large tier one legacy grid T&D equipment players who already have the capability to produce, let's say, a certain section of the entire system, is this an opportunity for them? Or do you think, pure play, smaller companies, homegrown companies, they can also be eyeing for this market?
Well, I think everyone has a role to play and an opportunity to take advantage of, so to speak. Of course, when a market is growing and expanding at this rate, it will create a lot of opportunity. And just again, within the few years that we have been in it, we've seen a tremendous growth in. I mean, we were also new to the industry at one point. We have to remember that. And just by approaching it in a different way, we have of course gotten some traction in it. But of course, there's the pie is getting bigger, so to speak, and I think it will also be unrealistic to think that PowerCon can supply every port around the world with all the systems that they need, right? So again, we do see more companies coming in, not only for the shore power substation where we convert the power, but especially also on the key side where you have the connection boxes and the cable management systems, where it gets to a more, I guess, practical side of it. How do we actually get that cable across to the vessel? Which in theory sounds very simple, but I can tell you it's not as simple as it sounds in some cases. And we have seen a lot of innovation, of new development going into that space. The systems being more automatic, being more easy to handle, being more safe, of course, also, again, with the standard being developed alongside of the industry as well. So I definitely think that we will continue to see more players eyeing an opportunity, and of course, again, also as the market is expanding, maybe seeing a specific problem out in the market that they have figured out how to tackle. And again, there's this, even though it's again on paper a simple task, there's a lot of variables to take into consideration, and sometimes the technology just might not be there today to have the completely ideal solution, so to speak. Right. But again, we have to start, and we will of course develop over the coming years and into the future. And I'm absolutely sure that more and new companies will help us along in achieving that. No doubt.
Great. So it means that it's an opportunity for pure play companies as well, and anybody new to this business, there is a huge opportunity for them to cash on.
Absolutely, and also just to collaborate. I mean, again, sometimes we go into project as a turnkey supplier, other times with sub suppliers, but it really just depends on who comes together around that that project. I mean, we have approached again, also the key side of it, sometimes thinking, there has to be a better way. Why can't it be this way? And then really
Mm,
start developing a new connection box, so to speak, like we did in Southampton. They asked for something, the port, saying, can we, integrate it into the ground? And it hasn't really been done at that point. And we thought, yeah, why not? Let's look at it. Let's try to invent something good here. Let's of course it has to
mm.
work in in the real world, so to speak. But again, we're constantly seeing every port is different, every key is different. So there's every time there's a new project, there's a new opportunity to do it better and more innovative than last time. So I think that in itself will keep pushing the industry, so to speak, and trying to come up with new ways, better ways, smarter ways of doing it. So I absolutely believe that there are opportunities for companies, big and small.
Fantastic point about the collaborative work as well. I think there's going to be a lot of competition, but cooperation as well moving forward. We saw a very similar pattern on the electrification of the traditional road transport sector and the charging infrastructure that is being installed. That there's a lot of competition, but we see a lot of collaboration going on as well. Companies who are hardcore, pure hardware manufacturers, they're collaborating with a lot of software companies as well. Now we see companies such as Siemens collaborating with Vitricity on wireless EV charging. A lot of collaboration and collaborative work going on that side. So I think we can expect similar patterns on the maritime industry side as well. Great. To wrap up this discussion of what is driving this market and what could be the potential inhibitors. Have we missed anything, Mustafa? Any other factors you think are driving this market forward or could be inhibiting this as well?
Yeah, I mean, like you have the EU Green Deal. You have the bipartisan plan, which is driving the market. Under the EU Green Deal, we have, of course, the Fit for 55 program and the Article 9 and 10 of the EU directives on
Hmm.
the alternative fuel technologies, which actually is now mandating using shore power on 10T core and comprehensive ports in Europe by 2025 and 2030 respectively, provided if the port achieves a certain number of port calls from certain types of vessels. So of course, that is one, you could say, a European, a grand European legislation or
Hmm.
a grand European plan which will enable more shore power systems on European shores. Um, Talking on a more global level, there are the IMO targets, the International Maritime Organization targets, which actually aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from marine activities by 75% by the end of the year 2050. And we're also seeing a lot of movement within individual companies and individual shipping companies. Very recently, this year in April 2022, there was a conference in Copenhagen, I suppose, where five cruise companies, you have, your big names like MSC Cruises, you have Viking Cruises, Carnival Corporation.
Hmm.
They actually joined hands to pledge that they'll decarbonize their cruise industry by using shore power and retrofitting their ships to enable to plug into the shore power in the Baltic Sea region. So when we talk about
Hmm.
Baltic Sea region, of course, you have the Nordics, you have Norway, Sweden, Finland, you have Germany, Hamburg, Estonia, those countries as well. So yeah, these are uh, plans not only driven by the governments or by the municipalities, but also by private shipping companies as well to get on the action on port decarbonization. Just to
Fantastic
add,
point.
just
Yep.
to
Hmm.
yeah, and just to add one thing, generally what we have seen while researching and while doing what we do is that ports require funding traditionally, and vessel operators or vessel companies, they require the incentives. to actually propagate the technology and drive the technology, because it's a two-way street. If ports install a shore power system, and if the vessels are not equipped with that, then there's no use of installing those systems, right? You need vessels to dock in and use those systems, so we need incentives for the vessel operators as well.
Very interesting, Mustafa. The point that you raised, that it's the shipping companies themselves too. They're in it, and once again, I can draw a very close parallel to the traditional road transport sector. Back in 2016 and 17, there was no high power charging infrastructure in Europe.
Mm.
Not a lot of charge point operators were there at that point. Basically, main automotive players in the region sat down and decided that, hey, why don't we install our own network? Let's get into it, and have a network of our own, so that we can move the industry towards electrification. And recently, a similar pattern was seen in the heavy transport sector as well. I think Daimler and Traton Group, two major groups in this industry, automotive players, they basically joined hands to install their own charging network for their electric trucks that they intend to sell in the coming years, right? So you mentioning that the vessel companies, the shipping industry itself is very heavily invested in this. I think that's a great point for the industry overall. All right, great. Then I'll move towards the last theme of today's discussion. That is the challenges that this industry is facing or might face moving forward. Mustafa, I'll have you comment on this first. And again, if I were to see, let's say, or were to draw a parallel with a nascent technology, which is it's with an aim to reduce the carbon footprint, right? So one example comes in my mind that utilities have a lot of grid equipment. Some of them are not very, let's say, eco-friendly, right? There are alternative technologies out there, but the reason why they're not very, let's say, heavily invested into this is because of high upfront costs, right? So they have a piece of equipment which they've installed for decades. It's working amazing. The whole system is working. Why would they change? Unless, there is some pressure in terms of the legislation from the outside. Otherwise there's no incentive because of the high upfront cost. You compare the two systems, one is definitely has a higher upfront cost, right? So that could be a limiting factor. Do you think would that be a right, let's say, comparison for the maritime industry as well? So if a port was to install a shore electrification system, would that be a concern in the minds of key stakeholders involved?
Yes, actually, when we go to the ports and when we talk to ports, cost is one of the main
Mm,
factors involved in, in the back of every port director's mind. They want a shore power system for the lowest cost possible, because hey, ports have never invested in shore power systems. They've never
mm,
invested in shore electrification. They have a very traditional and a very different role. So the upfront costs of a shore power system is, of course, reasonably high, especially if you're installing a high voltage system.
mhm,
It could go up to 3 to 4 million US dollars. Um, uh, for a high voltage system, and it requires serious amount of investment by ports, and usually ports do not have that investment. Ports need to get the fundings, get the necessary financing to do that. So cost is certainly one issue. Secondly, the return on investment, because
mm,
ports need to see, uh, if I am installing a system, um, will this generate profit for me? And for that, we've actually seen a couple of ports in Norway where there are plenty of shore power systems, but then yet again, they don't have the necessary vessel traffic to, reap the reward out of that system. So they're running at a loss. Um, Now, over here, it also depends what kind of a port is it. Is it a state-owned port, or is it a private or a
mm,
publicly owned port? So, for example, in Norway, we see there are a lot of state-owned ports. Those ports actually have the buffer to actually sustain some kind of a loss for some time. But when we see in markets such as the United Kingdom, for example, where most ports are publicly owned and they're privately owned, so for that kind of a port authority or that sort of ports, they of course need to look at their bottom line at the end of the day, and so return on investment is a very important factor for them. Then you have we were talking about different incentives, but of course the incentives are not uniform all across Europe or all across the US or Canada per se. You have regions with high investment and high incentivization, but then you have regions where you don't get those investments and incentives, and that actually is a big problem for shore power in certain parts of Europe, I would say. Then moving on to a very specific, well, not specific now, but high energy prices.
Mm-hmm.
Europe traditionally has one of the highest electricity prices globally, and that means ports need to purchase more electricity at a higher price. This of course makes shore power an expensive thing to actually use, both for the ports and for the ships as well. So the shipping operator or the vessel owner would have to see the electricity bill. They would have to do some calculations, and if it makes sense, then of course they'll plug in the system. Uh, but if the energy costs are so high, I'm sure they would be very happy to turn on their diesel generators after all. So that is where the legislation comes in, where you actually put some pressure on vessel operators or ports to actually use the shore power system despite high energy prices. Of course, we're seeing in recent months, we're also seeing global energy crisis happening specifically in Europe, where the electricity prices have, to be very honest, gone through the roof. So this is actually increasing this issue for shore power. Then, of course, we have also seen a lack in the local electricity grid in some places, especially where the ports are actually located in rural areas. So, like it's a normal thing that in rural areas the T&D equipment or the T&D infrastructure is not well maintained or is in a mundane position. So we have talked to many ports, and we have gotten feedback that the port wanted to install a shore power system on their terminal or on their berth, but the local electricity utility provider did not have the necessary spare capacity to allot to that port because of the installation of the system itself. So yes, of course, there are a lot of problems and a lot of hurdles which need to be addressed for the industry. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Mustafa. So, Ralf, I noted down 3 key challenges that Mustafa has identified. I'd like you to comment on these, and if you want to add, if there are other challenges you think the industry is facing. The first is the upfront high cost of the system. The second one, he talked about ROI. In terms of utilization of these systems, what's the ROI? Is that a concern in the minds of the key stakeholders? And the third one is the lack of infrastructure. Do you agree with all these 3 points as potential, let's say, bottlenecks, or let's say factors which are hindering the growth of the market?
Yeah, I think overall, like if we try to generalize across the industry, I think Mustafa is spot on. Cost is of course the number one thing we also hear as a supplier, but definitely also return on investment, and in general also the discussion that ports are having with their power suppliers, that they, like Mustafa is saying, we also hear from ports that actually want to do it, but can't get enough power simply down to the key. But I think it's also important to remember the nuances and try to turn it around, so to speak. What are we trying to do about it, so to speak? How are we trying to solve these challenges? Because I think no matter what, these challenges will continue for a while. But just because of that, or despite of that, we need to continue. So I think one of the ways is if we start with the cost aspect of it is of course how the industry has approached it, especially since we entered the market, which was exactly to drive down the cost. That was our number one goal. We saw an opportunity to help with the electrification in general, but just have the idea of there has to be a smarter way. It has to be a more cost efficient way to approach this. So that's what we did. So since we entered the market, prices or costs have come down by 30% on the overall investment, and I think we will continue to see that push. I mean, we as a company, of course, also innovating and developing in that direction. How can we optimize this? How can we make the systems smaller? How can we make them more efficient? How can we make them more flexible? But I think it's also just about the industry learning about this technology, because I mean, shore power is really like any other electrical infrastructure. So if you approach it the right way, you could also use it, to charge your cranes, to charge your electric vehicles. So it's about also, taking this more holistic approach to it and making sure that the ports are understanding what kind of investment they are looking into. And I think also the added benefits, so to speak, that shore power brings, because yes, you're looking at, like Mustafa is saying, like what can we actually charge? What can we charge the vessels for? But if you're looking at the cruise industry, yes, it might be more expensive for them to connect to shore power, but they're still willing to do it. Why is that? Well, because they understand. They want to be a good customer. They understand the PR value in shore power. They understand the added value in it. I mean, when ships come in and they connect to shore power, as you mentioned at the beginning, they can turn down the diesel engines. Well, that makes it easier for them to do maintenance on them. It means that they don't run their equipment as hard. That prolongs their lifetime span on their onboard systems. So there's some added benefits that I think ports also should keep in mind, and also add to the equation, so to speak, when they're having the cost analysis, so to speak. And that again, of course, also goes into the return on investment. If you can all of a sudden get a system that you can not only sell electricity to your ships, but you can also use it for your cranes, for your forklifts, for your electric vehicles, then all of a sudden it's a whole different investment that you're looking at, and an investment that typically will get a much more central part of your overall investment strategy as a port. So I think that's also one of the aspects to remember and to consider in this. And then also the fact that we do see some actually good business cases in some places, especially in Norway, of course, where they have so much power, hydropower, that they don't know what to do with it. Really, but of course that there are also cases where it actually makes sense to connect even for the customer. I mean, we have seen that here in Denmark too, where a drilling rig or an offshore supply vessel comes in and they dock for months and months and months. Well, all of a sudden we can help them power down because a diesel engine will run to a certain level. Well, you might not need that, so you can actually help optimizing the ships in that sense also. And again, as long as those diesel engines are running, they need staff on site. They need staff on the ship. Well, if you connect to shoreside electricity, you don't need that staff. So again, there's a lot of added benefits that come into the equation. Like I mentioned earlier, that they add complexity, so to speak, but it also makes it, it gives you a fresh perspective, so to speak, on the investment, because it's easy to see those, like Mustafa is saying, 3 to 4 million euros, and whoa, you take a step back and say, well, that's a bit much, but really when you start looking into and start to incorporate into other strategies, into other goals, and maybe also try to tap into other fundings that will allow you to pursue this, maybe not as a port something, but just in a sustainability goal in general, you might be able to tap into other fundings depending on where you are in the world, of course. But I think these are some of the aspects to consider. But of course, the high energy cost is a bottleneck that we do see in some places that are, that takes the challenge to to another level because you
Another
start
level. Mm.
looking at the grid side of it. But again, we see ports being actually proactive around and saying, you know what, we're gonna step into the conversation. We want to add pressure to the grid side, or help the grid side, putting pressure on the
Mm.
politicians, saying, you know what, we need more power. I mean, we want the shore power. We are willing to invest in it, but we need support. And that's how, if we have seen that in some cases where the industry and all the stakeholders are really coming together around this. Of course, it has a broader purpose than just shore power, possibly, but just in general about, how can we electrify more? How can we use it to charge the buses that we use in the city, during night? So again, we optimize the return on investment, so we get
Mm.
more out of that cost that we saw up front. So I think these are some of the aspects that we believe are important to consider and to remember. And I think it's absolutely clear that when you start to look at it,
Mm-hmm.
with some of these aspects in mind, a lot of ports are definitely seeing the value in it, and also again just the commitment in it, because you also have to remember, sustainability in general and electrification in general. What other options do the ports have? Shore power is definitely one of the major ones that will definitely have a big impact on their emissions, and I think a lot of ports are seeing that.
Fantastic point, Ralph. Do you think so? So you talked about life cycle cost needs to be taken into account. I think that's a brilliant point, that only upfront costs should not be, let's say, a point of, let's say, concern for ports installing the system. Do you think this could be sort of resolved with, educating the stakeholders as well?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think again, when we started out, it was mainly engineers and technical guys talking to engineers and technical guys. I think the audience has ballooned along with the market. I mean,
Mm,
we sometimes hear port CEOs calling us saying, I want shore power, and the conversation that you're having with him or her is completely different than if it is to an engineer or a technical person, right?
mm,
So I absolutely believe that there is a task to be done in the sense of educating the market. I think we are seeing that clearly also with the various events and conferences being held. I think the last 4, if not 5 conferences that I have attended myself, our presentation has been about what is shore power. What is it actually, and how does it work? And actually make the cruise guys, so to speak, who are out there selling cruise tickets every day, make them understand it,
mm,
and how can they understand it? And just recently, I was up in Finland with Cruise Baltic, who again signed that MOU, and they all walked away and thinking, we actually get it now. We understand what it is, and I think that's a good example of the task. That there is a need, but there's also a demand for it. That people really are interested in understanding this technology, and I think the industry definitely has to come together around that. But again, we're seeing it out there on the different conferences and trade shows. More sessions coming up, more panel discussions coming up about this technology,
mm.
and of course that is always great.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Mustafa. I'd like to conclude our discussion today. I think one of the key points that we discussed was that we are seeing similar patterns in the maritime industry, in the decarbonization of the maritime industry, as we saw in the electrification of the road transport sector. Similar kind of incentives, programs going on, technological issues that industry also face at that point, they're being resolved. And I think it's the same trajectory this industry can be falling, and there is a steep, let's say, learning curve involved, but all the stakeholders are, let's say, putting in their 100%. As you said, Ralph, the industry is getting a lot of traction, but more needs to be done in terms of funding, investment, technological advancements, making sure that the right standards are put in place as well, so that from an installation point of view, ports are also on board with the idea. And then we talked about the bottlenecks that the industry might be facing moving forward or is already facing. I think 30% cost reduction is already fantastic. If you look at some of the other nascent technologies, they do not go through this, let's say, reduction of cost in the first few years, as you've discussed for this industry. So I think there's a very bright future moving forward. And as you said, that it is getting there, but more needs to be done moving forward. I'd like to thank both of you for the insights, and I'd like to thank all the listeners, and hopefully we'll see you in the next episode of PDR Perspective. Thank you so much.